My name is Emily Parker. I'm 32, and if you looked at my family from the outside, you'd think we were the picture of harmony. But behind closed doors, love was measured in comparisons, and I was always the one who came up short next to my younger sister Claire. For years I tried to accept it, to keep my head down and find scraps of approval where I could. Then came last New Year's Eve. I thought we were finally gathering for something simple, something that could bring us together after years of distance. I poured my heart and savings into helping make it happen, convincing myself this time it might be different. But as the night unfolded, I watched my efforts quietly stolen and turned into a stage for someone else's triumph. And when my father leaned close, his grip firm on my arm, warning me not to make a scene, I knew the choice in front of me would change everything. Would you have stayed quiet or spoken the truth? Because what happened next still echoes through my life today. Let me take you back to where it began. I was born Emily Parker, the first daughter of Thomas and Margaret, in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland, Oregon. From the sidewalk, our house looked like something out of a magazine. A neat white fence, a row of lavender bushes that filled the summer air with their sweet scent, and windows glowing warmly in the evening. Neighbors waved and thought we were the picture of a happy American family. But inside those walls, the truth was far different, and I learned that lesson before I was even old enough to spell my own name. My father Thomas worked as a software engineer, a man of numbers who believed the world could be solved with equations. My mother Margaret prided herself on being the kind of mother who read every parenting book she could find. I was their experiment, their chance to raise a prodigy. But when I was 3 and could not yet recite the alphabet without stumbling, I saw the disappointment in their eyes. My father's face hardened like he was staring at a problem with no solution. My mother started speaking about golden years of development and missed opportunities. Then came my sister Claire. I was 4 when she was born, and it felt as if the air in the house shifted the day she arrived. Suddenly, every corner of the living room was filled with toys that sang in different languages, puzzles made of imported wood, and flashcards taped to the walls. I remember sitting in the corner building a crooked tower of blocks when my mother walked by, glanced at me, and said in a flat voice that Claire was only 7 months old and already responding to 3-step prompts. She told me to keep playing, as if my efforts belonged in another category altogether. The difference between us grew like a crack spreading across a wall. Claire had a high chair with soft music playing picture books from Sweden and a private tutor before she turned 2. I had stubby pencils and worksheets bought in bulk. When I brought home a painting at 8 years old that won 2nd place in the school competition, I was so proud. My mother gave it a quick glance before announcing to my father that Claire had just finished reading an entire short story by herself. He nodded approvingly, not even looking my way. There were no hugs or proud claps on the shoulder for me. I learned to stop expecting them. The moment that seared itself deepest into me came when I was 12. I had always had the upstairs bedroom with the window facing a small patch of woods. That room was my sanctuary. In the mornings, I would watch the sunlight slide in through the blinds and paint stripes across my desk. One evening, Claire burst in grinning. She announced that Mom had decided she was moving upstairs because she needed more space for her study corner. I told her no firmly because it was my room. She only shrugged and laughed. When I returned from school the next day, every trace of me had been erased. My posters gone, my desk gone, my books stuffed into boxes. Claire's name was already on the door, and a shiny new desk sat in the corner. I was moved into the cramped little room by the laundry, the one where the bed touched the wall and there was no space for a lamp. I stood in that tiny space, fists clenched, my throat burning, listening to the hum of the washer on the other side. I called out to my mother, demanding an explanation. She did not even turn her head. She said I was older now and needed to learn to give way. She told me not to make a scene. I remember sitting on the edge of that narrow bedlight from the hallway, spilling under the door, pale and unfamiliar, and realizing something cold and clear. In that house, I was not the firstborn or the daughter. I was the afterthought. The pattern continued into high school. Claire attended a private academy with a brand new SUV waiting in the driveway to take her to debate club and advanced math. I walked to my public school every morning in worn sneakers, carrying the weight of my books and the silence of my parents. I never asked for rides. I never complained. By then I was too used to being overlooked. There was one evening, though, that etched the unfairness in permanent ink. My grandparents Henry and Eleanor came for dinner. They were the only people who made me feel seen. My mother made lasagna. Claire chattered endlessly about her plans for a summer program at Stanford, and everyone smiled. Then my grandmother turned to me, her eyes soft, and asked if I had thought about college yet. I lifted my head and felt a small flame inside, ready to share my news. I told them I had applied to the University of Washington and UC Davis, and that I had just been accepted to Washington's business program with a partial scholarship. I did not even finish before my mother set down her fork with a sharp clink. She announced that my father and she had decided they could not help with my tuition. My father added that they had to prioritize Claire because she had been invited to an Ivy League prep program. My heart sank. I asked about the savings they always claimed were for both of us. My mother sighed as if she were explaining something obvious. She said Claire had real potential, and that I might consider community college or working for a while. The room fell into silence, broken only by the sound of my grandmother's spoon against her plate. Then my grandfather spoke, his voice steady. He said both girls were their granddaughters, and they could not sit by while one was cast aside. That night, as I cleared dishes in the kitchen, my grandmother came to me. She laid her hand on my shoulder and whispered that I did not have to carry this burden. She and my grandfather would pay for my college tuition, every cent. My eyes burned as I told her it was too much. She smiled and said it was not too much when it was an investment in someone who tried. Her words wrapped around me like a blanket I had never known. I realized then that even if my parents could not see me, there were still people who believed I was worth something. I carried that belief with me quietly like a hidden ember. It was the first spark of warmth that told me, maybe, just maybe, I was not destined to remain a shadow forever. And as I stood in my tiny room by the laundry that night, listening to the hum of the machines and the faint laughter from upstairs where Claire's new desk gleamed, I knew that my story inside that house had only one direction. It was pushing me out, away from them and towards something I could not yet see. By the time I turned 14, the difference between Claire and me had become impossible to ignore. She had tutors arriving at the house twice a week, stacks of brand new textbooks, and weekends filled with piano lessons and debate practice. My weekends were spent folding laundry, babysitting for neighbors, or working on essays at the kitchen table while Mom hovered over Claire in the dining room. There were afternoons when I came home with good news, like getting an A on a difficult math exam, but Mom barely looked up from helping Claire with her science project. If I tried to tell Dad, he would say he was too tired from work. Meanwhile, if Claire brought home a paper with a star on it, they would hang it on the fridge and invite the neighbors to look at it. I remember one particular Friday in 9th grade, when the school announced winners of the district art showcase. My watercolor of the Columbia River had taken first place. I could still smell the paint on my hands as I rushed through the front door holding the ribbon. Claire was on the couch surrounded by friends. Mom asked what all the fuss was, and I told her. She smiled faintly, then turned to Claire and said she should show her friends the essay she had written that morning. My ribbon ended up shoved into the drawer of my nightstand where no one ever saw it again. The distance between us was not just about achievements. Claire began to treat me the way our parents did, with casual dismissal. If I entered a room, she would look me up and down and say that my clothes looked like they came from a thrift store. Sometimes she would parade new outfits. Dad bought her spinning in front of the mirror. She enjoyed reminding me that she was the star. I kept my feelings to myself. It was safer that way. But keeping quiet did not mean I stopped noticing. At the dinner table, Claire talked about her upcoming trip with her school debate team to California. I mentioned that I wanted to join the business club at my school, and Dad immediately said the fees might be too much. My mother nodded in agreement and said we needed to be realistic. That word realistic cut deep, as if my dreams were illusions. The breaking point came during junior year of high school. Our guidance counselor had invited parents for a college planning night. I stood in the auditorium with my classmates and their families. When my counselor mentioned scholarships and state universities, I felt a flicker of hope. But on the car ride home, Mom told me point blank that the college fund was already committed to Claire. She explained it like a business decision, as if my future was a line item that did not make the cut. Dad agreed without hesitation. I remember looking out the window at the passing streetlights, feeling my throat tighten. I wanted to shout, to argue, to demand why my years of effort meant so little. Instead, I stayed silent. That silence burned more than words could have. A few weeks later, my grandparents came to visit. I had always felt closest to them, especially Grandma Eleanor, who used to tuck me in when she babysat. They noticed right away that I was quieter than usual. After dinner, Grandpa Henry asked me gently what was wrong. I told them about the college fund, how my parents had decided everything was for Claire's Ivy League program. My voice shook as I spoke, but once I started, I could not stop. I told them about years of being overlooked, about the bedroom, the ribbons, the conversations where I was made invisible. Grandma placed her hand on mine, her eyes steady. She said they had watched the difference in treatment for years, and it pained them deeply. She told me I was not invisible to them, and that I had shown resilience far beyond my age. Then she looked at Grandpa, and he nodded. He said they would cover my college tuition in full, no loans, no worry. I burst into tears, the kind of tears that come when you have held everything in too long. I told them it was too much, that I could not let them spend their savings on me. Grandpa smiled and said their savings meant nothing if they could not use it to build the future of someone who tried so hard. That night after they left, I sat on my bed and stared at the wall. For the first time in years, I felt something different. Not joy exactly, but a steady warmth that came from knowing someone believed in me. I could almost hear Grandma's voice saying that I was worth investing in. My parents, of course, reacted coldly when they found out. Mom accused me of going behind their backs, and Dad muttered that I should not expect charity. But I no longer cared what they thought. I had been handed a lifeline, and I was determined not to waste it. The days leading up to graduation passed in a blur of applications, essays, and part-time shifts at a cafe down the street. Every night I worked late, then came home and studied until my eyes ached. I pinned the acceptance letter from the University of Washington to my bulletin board, right above the drawer that still held that old art ribbon. It reminded me that, even if no one in my house had celebrated me, my future did not depend on their recognition. On the morning of my high school graduation, I slipped into my cap and gown, adjusting the tassel in the mirror. Claire had already announced she was going to New York for her summer prep program, and my parents were buzzing with excitement for her. They seemed to forget I was even graduating that day. But when I walked across the stage and received my diploma, I searched the crowd and found my grandparents standing and clapping with tears in their eyes. That sight carried me through. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I packed away the cap and gown and sat quietly in my room. I knew the next chapter of my life was about to begin. I had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but I held on to the promise that someone believed I could succeed, and that belief would have to be enough to carry me into the unknown. The summer before college felt like a blur, a mixture of nervous energy and quiet determination. I worked extra shifts at the cafe down the street, pouring coffee for tired commuters and wiping down counters late at night. Every dollar I saved went into a jar tucked in my closet money. I knew I would need for books and meals once I left home. My parents barely asked about my plans. Most of their attention was on Claire, who was preparing to fly to New York for her prep program. Suitcases crowded the hallway, filled with expensive clothes Dad had insisted she needed. When the day came for me to leave for the University of Washington, Mom offered a half-hearted hug at the door. She told me to be frugal and not expect much. Dad barely looked up from his laptop. Claire scrolled on her phone, only mumbling a distracted goodbye. I rolled my suitcase down the walkway, the sound of its wheels against the pavement echoing louder than any of their words. Grandpa Henry and Grandma Eleanor were waiting in their old red sedan, waving from the curb. The moment I climbed into the back seat and felt their warmth, I knew I had already left that other life behind. Arriving in Seattle was like stepping into another world. The campus stretched wide with old brick buildings and tall trees that whispered in the wind. Students bustled across the lawns, laughing, carrying books, rushing to class. For the first time, I felt like I was part of something larger, a place where I could carve out an identity not tied to being the overlooked daughter. My dorm room was small, but mine, really mine. 2 twin beds pressed against opposite walls, a desk by the window, overlooking the quad. My roommate Sarah Thompson arrived later that afternoon. She had kind eyes, curly brown hair, and the easy confidence of someone who grew up in a family that supported her. She studied education and told me she wanted to teach high school English. That night, after unpacking, we stayed up talking until past midnight, sharing stories of our childhoods. When I told her about Claire and how invisible I often felt, Sarah shook her head in disbelief. She said I deserved better, and somehow hearing that from a near stranger meant more than hearing silence from my own family for years. The weeks rolled into a rhythm. I attended lectures, took notes furiously, and worked shifts at a little diner off campus to cover extra expenses. There were nights I returned, exhausted, grease still clinging to my clothes, but I refused to fall behind in my classes. The business program was competitive, filled with sharp students who seemed to glide effortlessly through assignments. I often felt like I was chasing shadows, but I kept running. One afternoon, after turning in an economics paper, I found an email in my inbox. It was from the scholarship committee, confirming that I had been awarded an additional grant to cover the rest of my tuition. I sat at the library desk staring at the screen until my eyes blurred. Relief washed over me in waves. No loans, no endless nights wondering how to pay the next semester. I thought of my grandparents again, their promise to help, and how much lighter this news would make their burden too. That evening, I called them from a bench near the fountain at the center of campus. Grandpa picked up his voice, warm and steady. I told him the news, and I could hear Grandma cheering in the background. He said he always knew I would find a way, that sometimes hard work has to meet a little grace. I sat there under the fading sun, clutching the phone to my ear, tears rolling down my face, but not from sadness this time. Life at college was not all easy. There were nights when I lay awake in the narrow dorm bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic, and wondered if I truly belonged. Students around me came from families who sent them care packages and visited on weekends. I went months without hearing from my parents. Occasionally, Mom sent a short text reminding me to focus, but it was never more than a few words. Claire posted photos online of parties in New York, standing next to new friends in glittering dresses, always with that same smug smile. Sarah often pulled me into her circle of friends. They went out for pizza, studied together, laughed about professors' quirks. Sometimes I joined, sometimes I stayed back, lost in my books. What surprised me most was how often they came to me for advice, asking me to look over assignments or explain concepts. For the first time, my effort was not invisible. It mattered to someone. The first winter in Seattle was damp and gray, rain misting across the windows day after day. I buried myself in the library stacks, surrounded by the smell of paper and ink. I read about market trends, consumer psychology, and investment strategies late into the night, often losing track of time until the janitor flicked the lights to remind me the building was closing. There was something about the quiet rows of books that made me feel safe, like I was building a world where no one could strip away my progress. When finals came, I studied harder than ever. The morning grades were posted. I logged into the portal with my heart racing. Straight A's. I could hardly believe it. Sarah hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. She said I had proved to everyone, but mostly to myself, that I belonged here. I carried that momentum into the following semester, applying for internships and research programs. Rejection letters piled up, but I kept applying. I knew doors had to open eventually, and each no only sharpened my resolve. One evening in spring, as cherry blossoms scattered across the sidewalks, I received an email from Professor Alan Grant. He had noticed my work in class and recommended me for a summer internship at a prestigious investment firm in downtown Seattle. Coleman and White Capital. My hands trembled as I read his words. This was the kind of opportunity students dreamed about, the kind that could change everything. I looked out the dorm window at the fading light, the petals swirling in the breeze, and felt a deep certainty rise within me. The girl who once sat in a tiny room by the laundry, unseen and unheard, was about to step onto a path her parents never believed she could walk. And I intended to take every step of it. The morning I walked into Coleman and White Capital for the first time, my palms were damp with nerves. The glass doors reflected the skyline of Seattle, tall and shimmering, and as I pulled them open, I felt like I was stepping into another universe. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. My heels clicked on the marble floor as I approached the front desk. The receptionist handed me a visitor badge with a polite smile, and I clipped it to my blazer, praying my hands would stop shaking. I was led into a large conference room with a long oak table that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of Elliott Bay. 3 managers sat across from me, their suits sharp, their expressions unreadable. I set my resume in front of them, trying to keep my shoulders straight, even as my heart thumped hard enough to make my chest ache. One of them, a man with graying hair and stern eyes, leaned forward and asked what I thought was the most important factor in investment strategy. I took a breath, forcing myself to steady. I told him it was not only the data, but understanding the psychology behind it, how people make choices in moments of fear and hope. For a second, I worried I had said too much, but then I caught the subtle exchange of glances between them, the slight nods. When they thanked me and stood, I exhaled so deeply it felt like I had been holding my breath for hours. 2 days later, the email came. I had been accepted into their internship program. The first weeks were brutal. I arrived before the sun rose and often left long after it had set. My desk sat in a corner of the open office, stacked with reports and printouts I could barely carry. I was expected to analyze trends, draft memos, and sit in on meetings where the conversation flew faster than I could write. I kept a small notebook tucked in my lap, scribbling notes about terms I did not understand, so I could look them up later. There were moments I wanted to give up. One morning, I spilled coffee on a set of reports and thought for sure it would be the end of me. Michael Rivera, a full-time analyst, who seemed to enjoy watching interns squirm, smirked as he helped me mop up the mess. He muttered that some people were not cut out for this world. The word stung, but instead of answering back, I went home that night and studied twice as hard. Professor Grant checked in with me once, inviting me for coffee on campus during the weekend. He asked how it was going, and I admitted it felt like drowning. He chuckled softly and said drowning was how you learn to swim in finance, that if I could survive this, I would learn more than any classroom could offer. His confidence steadied me. I started finding small victories. One day, I noticed a pattern in a set of numbers that did not add up. When I pointed it out, expecting to be brushed off, one of the senior associates actually thanked me. Another time, I stayed late to finish a report and caught Richard Coleman himself leaving the building. He paused by my desk, asked what I was working on, and listened as I explained. He nodded slowly, his gaze sharp, but not unkind, then told me to keep at it. That brief exchange carried me for weeks. Still, the atmosphere was cutthroat. Michael made little comments sometimes in front of others, questioning whether I was there because of a diversity quota. I bit my tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. At night, I would sit in my dorm staring at the Seattle skyline through the window, promising myself that I would prove I belonged. It was during one of those long nights that the idea for Prism began to form. I had been poring over charts, frustrated with how numbers alone never seemed to tell the whole story. Markets were moved by people, not just spreadsheets. I began building a simple model on my laptop, adding in variables like consumer sentiment, social trends, even political shifts. It was messy, full of gaps, but something about it made sense to me. I kept it secret, working on it after hours, saving files under harmless names so no one would suspect. Every time Michael sneered at me, it only fueled my determination. I wanted something that could not just keep me afloat, but prove I was more than the girl they thought would fade away. One late afternoon, as rain streaked down the office windows, I was called into another meeting. The managers sat around the table, tossing questions at me faster than I could think. I felt the heat rise in my face, my notebook filling with frantic scribbles. Then, almost instinctively, I drew from the small patterns I had noticed while working on Prism. I explained how short-term consumer behavior was skewing the numbers, how the data looked different when you accounted for the emotional swings in the market. The room went quiet. The man with the graying hair tapped his pen on the table, then said it was an interesting perspective. That word interesting felt like a door cracking open. When the meeting ended, I stepped out into the hallway, my heart still pounding but lighter somehow. That night, I walked back to my dorm, drenched in the drizzle, my shoes squeaking on the sidewalk. Sarah was waiting inside, curled up on her bed with a book. She asked how my day went. I dropped my bag, kicked off my soaked shoes, and told her I thought maybe for the first time that I had actually done something right. She grinned and said she never doubted it. I went to sleep that night with the sound of rain against the window, my laptop glowing faintly on the desk. Prism was still just an idea, fragile and unfinished, but it was mine. And for the first time I felt the faint pull of a future that could finally belong to me. The weeks at Coleman and White Capital blurred into each other, long days that started before sunrise and often ended when the cleaning staff pushed their carts past my desk. I was still the intern in the corner, but I began to notice how much more comfortable I felt with the rhythm. My pen moved faster, my notes sharper, my instincts just a little steadier. The pressure never left, but I was no longer drowning. I was learning to swim. Not everyone was happy about it. Michael Rivera, the analyst who had already made his opinion of me clear, seemed to take it as a personal challenge to chip away at my confidence. He would drop by my desk with a smirk and ask if I had figured out what EBITDA stood for, yet knowing full well I had already answered that question weeks ago. In meetings, he would interrupt, correcting me, even when I was right, or dismissing my observations as beginner's luck. At first I swallowed the sting, telling myself it was just office banter, but the truth was he wanted me to fail. One morning I walked into the office and found a thick stack of reports waiting on my chair. They were due in an hour and had to be reviewed before being passed to senior management. My name was written on a sticky note attached to the top. I glanced across the room and caught Michael's grin. It was the kind of grin that said he expected me to drown in paperwork and miss the deadline. My pulse raced as I sat down and flipped open the first file. For an hour I read line after line, scanning for inconsistencies, circling numbers that didn't match typing notes as fast as my fingers would allow. By the time I handed them in, my back ached and my eyes felt like sandpaper, but I had finished with 2 minutes to spare. Later that day, one of the managers stopped by and told me I had done good work catching a minor error in one of the models. Michael's smirk was gone when he passed my desk. I could have left it there, satisfied with surviving, but something inside me wanted more. Every night I returned to my dorm and opened Prism on my laptop. The program was still crude, just rows of spreadsheets with formulas branching like vines, but it gave me a different way to see the numbers. Instead of treating the market like a machine, I treated it like a living thing, swayed by fear, excitement, rumors, and global events. I fed in news articles, consumer surveys, and social media trends, then compared them with historical data. Slowly, the patterns began to line up. It all came to a head in the spring of 2021. The firm was heavily invested in a cluster of tech companies that everyone believed were on the brink of explosive growth. The analysts were enthusiastic, reports were glowing, and investors were eager to pour in more money. But when I ran the data through Prism, the picture looked wrong. The numbers seemed inflated, like the companies were propping up sales through internal transactions. I stared at the screen late into the night, my stomach tightening. If I was right, the firm was on the verge of a massive loss. I barely slept that weekend. I checked and rechecked, combed through footnotes in financial statements, followed trails of obscure press releases. Every arrow pointed the same direction. The growth was a mirage. On Monday morning, I walked into the office with a thick binder of printouts and a pit in my stomach. My hands trembled as I asked to speak in the manager's meeting. Michael laughed when he saw me carrying the binder, muttering that interns were supposed to fetch coffee, not rewrite strategy. When I stood at the front of the room, the executives looked at me with polite impatience. I laid out the numbers page by page, explaining the risks. At first, the room was silent, then skeptical questions flew at me. How could I be sure? What source did I rely on? Why should they trust an intern over established analysts? I answered as calmly as I could, pointing back to the data showing the anomalies, the unnatural sales spikes that matched no consumer behavior pattern. When I finished, my voice shook, but I forced myself to meet their eyes. The CFO leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Richard Coleman, who had been silent the whole time, and said that if my analysis was correct, she may have just saved us from a disaster. Richard nodded slowly, then asked me to leave the binder. 3 days later, the decision came down. The firm would quietly reduce exposure to those tech companies pulling out before the crash. I sat at my desk, barely able to breathe, waiting to see if I had ruined myself or proved my worth. 2 weeks later, the market confirmed everything. Those companies collapsed their stock values, tumbling like stones in water. Other firms lost billions. We lost nothing. The atmosphere in the office shifted overnight. People who once walked past my desk without a glance now stopped to ask my opinion. Senior analysts leaned in during meetings when I spoke. Even Michael was forced into silence, his earlier smirks replaced by a tight jaw and narrowed eyes. I knew he resented me more than ever, but I did not care. For the first time, I felt the weight of my own voice in that building. Richard Coleman called me into his office not long after. His office overlooked the bay sunlight bouncing off the water and flooding the room. He congratulated me, saying I had shown rare insight and the kind of courage it took to speak up when no one else would. He told me to keep developing whatever method I had used, to not let anyone push me aside. I left his office with my legs shaking, but there was a new steadiness in my chest. That night I sat on my dorm bed, staring out the window at the lights of Seattle, glittering like 1,000 possibilities. Sarah was reading across the room, but when she saw my face, she put her book down and asked what had happened. I told her everything from Prism to the meeting to the outcome. She threw her arms around me, laughing and crying at the same time, and said I had finally proven to the world what she already knew. I did not tell my parents. I knew they would find a way to dismiss it, to turn it into a fluke, or redirect the conversation back to Claire. Instead, I called my grandparents. When I told Grandpa Henry, he let out a low whistle, and Grandma Eleanor said they had never doubted me for a moment. Their pride filled the space my parents never could. I went to sleep that night with exhaustion pressing down on me, but I could not stop smiling. For once I was not invisible, my work had mattered, and I was only just beginning. The months after the tech stock collapse felt like a whirlwind. Coleman and White Capital reported a 12% growth, that quarter the highest in more than a decade, and people whispered in the halls that it was because of one intern who had seen what no one else had. I tried not to let it go to my head. Every morning I still showed up early, still stayed late, still scribbled notes into my little notebook. But there was a new energy around me, a sense that I had finally stepped out of the corner. Richard Coleman invited me into more meetings sometimes, asking for my input directly, which made seasoned analysts glance my way with mixed respect and irritation. I felt the pressure building with every nod of acknowledgement every time someone lingered a little longer after I spoke. Yet with that pressure came a strange steadiness. I realized I wanted to stay in this world not just as a visitor, but as someone who could shape it. By the end of the internship, I was offered a full-time role. When I held the letter in my hands, I thought of the girl sitting by the laundry room back in Portland, the one who had once believed she would never be seen. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my bag, determined not to waste the chance. Working full-time was even more demanding. I was no longer just the intern who surprised everyone once. I had to prove myself every single day. Michael Rivera kept his distance for a while, licking his wounds, but eventually found small ways to challenge me again. He would leave me off group emails, then act surprised when I did not know the agenda. He would roll his eyes in meetings if I asked a question. I ignored him and poured myself into my work, refining Prism in the quiet hours after the office emptied. Prism began to evolve into something more than a side project. I added layers, feeding it not only financial data, but also news cycles, consumer surveys, and even trending topics on social media. It was clumsy at first, too noisy, but then I started noticing predictions that lined up almost eerily with market swings. I kept it to myself, knowing it was not ready, but every night I felt a growing sense that I was onto something bigger. In the spring of 2022, I was asked to present in front of the executive board for the first time. The topic was risk management in emerging markets, a subject that intimidated me. I spent days preparing, rehearsing in my apartment until my voice cracked. When the day came, I walked into the boardroom with trembling hands. The long table was lined with people who had been in finance longer than I had been alive. I took a breath and spoke, my voice quiet at first, then stronger as I laid out my analysis. When I finished, the room was silent. For a moment, I feared I had failed. Then Richard Coleman leaned forward and said it was sharp work, that I was asking the right questions. The relief almost made my knees buckle. Later, as I walked back to my desk, one of the senior associates muttered that I was moving faster than anyone had expected. I carried those words with me when I went to visit my grandparents that weekend. Their house was the same red brick home, filled with warmth, the kind of place where the smell of baking bread greeted you before you even opened the door. Grandma Eleanor set a plate of cookies in front of me and asked about my job. I told her about the presentation, about Prism, about how the CEO himself had praised me. She listened with that soft smile that always made me feel like the most important person in the world. Grandpa Henry chuckled, saying he was not surprised that I had always been the sharpest in the room. Their pride filled a space that had been empty for too long. It was during that visit that Claire walked in unexpectedly. She was 24 by then, dressed in designer jeans and carrying a purse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She hugged our grandparents with exaggerated warmth, then turned to me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She said she had exciting news of her own, that she had been working on a big announcement she would share soon. The way she said it was less about sharing joy and more about staking territory. I only nodded, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. That night, lying in my old bed at their house, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how far apart our lives had grown. She still thrived on attention, on being the center of the stage. I had stopped seeking that long ago, but a part of me knew our paths were about to collide again. Back at the office, Prism caught the attention of one of my colleagues after I used it to flag a risky investment that no one else had questioned. When the numbers proved right, people began to whisper again, asking what method I was using. I downplayed it, calling it intuition and extra hours, but inside I knew Prism was slowly becoming too big to hide. Richard Coleman stopped me in the hallway one morning. He told me to keep pushing, that the firm needed people who could see the market differently. Then he paused and added that leadership was always watching for the next generation to step up. His words lingered with me long after he walked away. I still worked through the nights, refining formulas, running simulations, watching Prism take shape on the screen like a living map of the market's moods. There were times I felt exhausted, stretched thin between proving myself at work and building something no one had asked for. But then I would remember the smirk on Michael's face, the silence of my parents, the way Claire's smile twisted with superiority. Those memories fueled me more than coffee ever could. One evening, as I left the office, the city lights spread across the bay in a glittering reflection. I stood for a moment, the cool air brushing my face, and felt the quiet certainty growing inside me. I was not the forgotten child anymore. I was carving a place for myself piece by piece, in a world that once seemed closed to me. And though I did not know it yet, the choices I was making in those late nights, in the quiet glow of my computer screen, would set the stage for everything that came next. Thanksgiving of 2023 was the first time I had gone back to my parents' house in months, and even then, I only stayed a few hours. The rooms felt the same, filled with the same furniture, the same smell of pot roast, but nothing about the people inside felt like home anymore. Claire breezed in wearing a cream coat with a silk scarf, her phone in hand, talking loudly about her new friends and her plans in Los Angeles that never seemed to materialize. My mother followed her around, hanging on every word, while my father nodded and occasionally reminded her not to forget about her future. I sat quietly at the table, focusing on the cranberry sauce, pretending I did not notice how little attention was given to me. A week later, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. She said they were planning a family dinner on New Year's Eve and thought it would be a good time to reunite. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep protecting the distance I had built for myself. But then another thought came, quieter and harder to shake. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something different. I called her that evening and said I would come. She sounded almost relieved, which surprised me. She suggested I could contribute by covering the catering, decorations, and drinks. The words were framed like an invitation but felt like an expectation. I hesitated, then agreed. She said she would handle everything else and make it a night the whole family would remember. The next day, I transferred $4,200 into her account. It was not a small sum, but with my position at Coleman & White, it was manageable. I told myself it was worth it if the night gave us even a chance at mending something. When I told Sarah about it over coffee, she looked at me as if I had lost my mind. She asked why I would trust them again, especially after everything they had done. I tried to explain that I did not want to keep carrying the weight of bitterness into another year. She shook her head but reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she hoped she was wrong, and that maybe my family would finally surprise me. In the weeks that followed, I let myself imagine what the dinner might be like. I pictured laughter echoing across the table, candles flickering in the center, maybe even a small moment where my parents looked at me, not as the daughter who disappointed them, but as someone they could be proud of. I bought a new dress, emerald green, with a simple neckline, elegant but not loud. I told myself I would keep expectations low, but hope has a way of sneaking in even when you try to shut it out. As the date approached, my mother called with updates. She said the house would be decorated beautifully, that the food would be the best she could order. She spoke with a tone that made me believe for just a moment that she was excited to honor me too. Each time I hung up the phone, I tried to quiet the small voice inside, warning me not to be naive. On the morning of December 31st, I packed an overnight bag and set out for Portland. The sky was gray, low clouds pressing down on the freeway, the kind of winter day that felt suspended in stillness. I drove with the radio low, my thoughts drifting between anticipation and unease. My grandparents had called the night before, promising to be there as well. Knowing they would be in the room steadied me. I pulled up to the house, just as the sun dipped behind the trees. Lights glowed from every window, and even from the driveway I could see hints of gold ribbon twined around the staircase inside. I paused for a moment, before stepping out of the car, smoothing the wrinkles in my dress, reminding myself that tonight could be different. The door opened before I reached it. My mother greeted me with a bright smile, pulling me into a hug that felt rehearsed. Behind her, the house shimmered with decorations, far more lavish than I had imagined. White orchids lined the dining table, candles flickered in glass holders, and the air smelled of roasted meats and expensive wine. For a moment, I was stunned by the beauty of it all, though a flicker of doubt stirred in my chest. Guests were already milling about, neighbors and relatives I had not seen in years. My grandparents stood by the small bar in the corner, chatting warmly. I rushed to hug them, feeling my shoulders drop in relief at their presence. Grandpa Henry whispered that I looked like I belonged in the boardroom, not just this party, and Grandma Eleanor patted my cheek with pride shining in her eyes. Claire had not yet appeared, though I could hear her laughter upstairs. My father made small talk with some cousins near the fireplace, glancing at me only briefly before turning back to his drink. I tried to push away the sting and focused on the warmth of the room, telling myself to give it time. As I moved through the crowd, I noticed people glancing toward the staircase, whispering in low tones. My mother fussed over the table settings, adjusting silverware, her expression carrying a kind of anticipation that made me uneasy. I poured myself a glass of champagne and stood near the window, watching the sky darken, reminding myself that it was too late to second guess. The evening was just beginning, but already something in the air felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. By 7 o'clock, the house was glowing like a lantern. Golden light spilled across the walls, bouncing off the crystal glasses and polished silverware. Conversations rose and fell around the dining room as more guests arrived. I moved from group to group, smiling politely, though inside I felt strangely out of place. I had helped fund this entire evening, yet it felt like I was drifting along the edges, waiting for some unspoken moment to arrive. My mother swept through the room with the grace of a hostess who had been rehearsing for weeks. She adjusted flowers, whispered instructions to the servers, and leaned in to kiss cheeks as if she were presiding over a gala instead of a family dinner. My father followed her, offering handshakes and laughter that never reached his eyes. Watching them, I wondered if they had ever imagined this night as mine. The thought made my chest tighten. Guests admired the decorations, the orchids spilling across the tables, the shimmering gold ribbons climbing the staircase banister. My cousins whispered that the whole thing looked like a wedding reception. I caught pieces of their conversation and felt heat creep up my neck. This was supposed to be a New Year's Eve family dinner, not a stage. I spotted my grandparents near the bar, their presence anchoring me as the room buzzed louder. Grandma Eleanor raised her glass in a small toast when our eyes met, her quiet way of reminding me that she was here for me. That look steadied me enough to take a sip of champagne, though unease still lingered like a shadow. The clock edged toward 8, and the dinner plates were being cleared for dessert. My mother tapped her glass, calling for everyone's attention. The chatter hushed the air, shifting as heads turned toward her. I straightened in my chair, thinking she might acknowledge me, maybe even let me speak about the reason I believed we had gathered. But instead, she smiled wide, gesturing toward the staircase. Claire appeared at the top step as if she had been waiting for her cue. She wore a red satin gown that caught the light with every move. Her hair was styled perfectly, makeup flawless. The room erupted in applause before she even spoke, as though they already knew this was her night. I froze my champagne glass halfway to my lips. She descended slowly, one hand on the rail, the other entwined with the hand of a tall man in a dark suit. He looked polished, his expression serious but nervous. I realized then that I had never met him before. My stomach sank as whispers rippled through the room. My mother lifted her hands, her voice rising with pride. She announced that this evening was not only about welcoming the new year, but celebrating a milestone in Claire's life. She introduced the man at her side as Andrew Miller, Claire's fiancé. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by cheers and clinking glasses. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat. This was it, the reason the dinner had been dressed up like a wedding. The reason whispers had followed the staircase all evening. My money, my hope for reconciliation, had been used to stage Claire's engagement announcement. Andrew cleared his throat, thanking everyone for being there. He wrapped his arm around Claire's waist, beaming as she flashed the diamond ring on her finger. Relatives surged forward to hug them, offer congratulations, and gush over the ring. The orchids, the candles, the ribbons, all of it was for this moment. I could barely hear their words over the rush of blood in my ears. My mother leaned toward me briefly, her voice low but firm. She said not to make a scene, that this was Claire's moment, and that I should be happy for her. My father added a warning glance from across the room, his jaw tight. I felt pinned in place, my throat burning with unspoken words. I forced myself to stand and move toward the window, pretending to admire the lights outside. My grandparents followed me with their eyes, but neither spoke, not yet. I gripped the edge of the curtain, steadying myself as laughter and music swirled around me. Claire basked in the glow, thanking guests, as though she were the queen of the night. Andrew looked happy, unaware of the betrayal unfolding beneath the surface. My mother raised another toast, declaring how proud she was, how this was the start of a new chapter for Claire. Not once did she mention that this night had been planned, funded, and hoped for by me. The applause rang in my ears hollow and sharp. I knew then that this was not just another slight. This was a message loud and cruel, that in their eyes Claire would always matter more no matter what I achieved or how hard I tried. I turned back toward the room, watching the sea of smiling faces. My chest rose and fell with the weight of a decision pressing against me. I could stay silent as I had for so many years, or I could speak and risk unraveling the illusion they had built so carefully tonight. The music swelled, laughter rose again, and all eyes were on Claire at the center of it all. My glass trembled in my hand as I realized I could not carry this silence much longer. Claire lifted her glass and smiled as if the whole evening existed for her alone. She thanked our parents for making everything perfect, then leaned into Andrew's shoulder, the diamond ring flashing under the chandelier. Guests clapped again, louder this time, and the sound seemed to blur around me. I felt as if I were watching from outside a window pressed against the glass, shut out of the very night I had created. I tried to swallow the rising tide in my chest, but my father appeared at my side. He placed a firm hand on my arm, his grip too tight to be gentle. His voice was low, sharp enough to slice through the noise. "Do not ruin this. If you say a word, you will lose everything. The inheritance, the family, all of it." His eyes bore into mine, daring me to defy him. I froze, my glass trembling in my hand. My mother raised her glass again, calling for another toast. She declared how proud she was of Claire, how this engagement marked the beginning of a brilliant future, and how fortunate Andrew was to be joining such a special family. The words made bile rise in my throat. For years I had been the quiet one, the overlooked one, and here I was again funding a celebration where my name was not even whispered. I thought of the late nights at my desk, the endless hours refining reports, the sacrifices I had made to reach my career milestones. None of it mattered in this room. What mattered was Claire, glowing in red satin, smiling at her audience. Andrew stepped forward to speak. He thanked my parents for hosting and said how honored he felt to be welcomed into such a supportive family. Supportive. The word echoed in my head like a cruel joke. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but instead I pressed my nails into my palm, grounding myself against the sting. The guests leaned in, hanging on every word Claire spoke. She announced that alongside her engagement, she was launching a fashion business with Andrew's backing. Applause filled the room once more. I saw heads nodding, relatives whispering about how impressive it was. No one seemed to notice me standing there silent, with the weight of betrayal pressing down on my shoulders. My grandparents sat still at their table, their faces tight. Grandma Eleanor's hand rested on Grandpa Henry's arm, and I could see the fury in her eyes, though she stayed quiet. She knew this was my moment to claim or to lose. Claire turned to me at last, her smile sugary sweet. She said she hoped I was happy for her, that family always came first, and that we should all raise a glass to new beginnings. Her words were meant to sound gracious, but I heard the barb underneath. She wanted to show everyone I had accepted her spotlight. I lifted my glass slowly, my father's grip still heavy on my arm. The clinking of crystal surrounded me, a hollow chorus of compliance. My pulse hammered in my ears. I could not breathe under the weight of it all. In that moment, I remembered the years of silence, the ribbon shoved in a drawer, the bedroom taken from me, the college fund redirected. Every slight, every dismissal, every time I had been told to be realistic, to step aside, to keep quiet. And now once again I was being told to yield. I set my glass down on the table. My father's hand tightened, but I pulled free, standing straighter than I ever had in that house. My mother's eyes narrowed, sensing the shift. The chatter died down as people noticed me finally standing with a determination I had hidden for too long. I did not raise my voice, but the room fell silent anyway. I said that tonight had been presented as a family gathering, a New Year's Eve dinner that I had helped bring to life. I told them I had paid for the catering, the flowers, the candles, every detail they admired. I had believed it would be an evening where we came together, but it had been turned into something else without a word to me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother's face stiffened, her smile frozen. Claire's cheeks flushed red beneath her makeup. Andrew turned to her in confusion. He asked quietly if what I said was true. She tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a misunderstanding, that we had all worked together. But I shook my head and told him clearly that I had wired the money, that my mother had promised to handle the arrangements, and that never once had they mentioned this would be her engagement party. The silence grew heavier. Andrew looked at Claire, waiting for her to deny it, but she stammered instead, insisting she had only wanted the right moment to share her happiness. He pulled back slightly, his smile gone. My father barked at me to sit down, his voice cracking with anger, but I did not move. I told them all that this was not about an engagement or a ring. It was about being erased again, being asked to stay silent while my family celebrated on my shoulders. Andrew set his glass down hard on the table. His voice was low, but the disappointment in it was unmistakable. He said he had come expecting honesty, not to discover that his fiancée had staged their announcement with someone else's money. Claire reached for his arm, but he stepped away, his face pale. The room was tense, every guest caught between loyalty and shock. Claire's composure shattered as she turned on me, accusing me of jealousy, of always trying to take her joy. Her voice rose shrill, carrying through the hall. I did not answer. I only stood firm, my silence heavier than any words. Grandma Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. She said enough. She told Claire that responsibility could not be built on deception and that family could not thrive on favoritism. My grandfather nodded his eyes, never leaving my parents. My mother rushed forward, furious, demanding to know who I thought I was to humiliate my sister in front of everyone. My father clenched his fists at his sides, his glare burning. I looked at them both, my chest rising steadily, and for the first time in my life, I felt no need to justify myself. The truth was out in the open, and no amount of anger or denial could bury it again. Andrew turned, his voice low but final, saying he needed space to think. He walked out the front door, leaving Claire calling after him, her voice breaking, but he never looked back. The sound of the door closing left the room in a silence that seemed to stretch forever. I stood there, my hands steady now, knowing that nothing in our family would ever return to the way it had been before that night. Claire's scream echoed down the hallway as she bolted after Andrew, her heels clattering against the hardwood floor. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and my parents, unsure whether to speak or slip away quietly. The music that had been playing softly in the background had long since stopped, leaving only the heavy breathing of people caught in the middle of a storm they had not expected. My father's face turned crimson. He pushed past a cousin and strode toward me, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck twitched. He told me I should know my place, that this was still his house, his family, and I had no right to embarrass them. I met his glare without flinching. My voice was quiet but steady when I said that what I had done was nothing more than telling the truth. My mother rushed to his side, her face pale with anger and humiliation. She demanded to know how I could do this to my sister, how I could ruin her night in front of everyone. I stared at her, remembering every small dismissal, every time she told me to be realistic, every time she asked me to step aside for Claire. I told her plainly that I had been silent long enough and that I would not be erased again. The room buzzed with low murmurs. Some relatives avoided my gaze, pretending to be fascinated by the untouched dessert table. Others leaned closer, their curiosity sharpened by the tension. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, calculating, but for once, it did not matter. Claire burst back into the room, her mascara streaking down her cheeks, her voice shaking with rage. She pointed at me and accused me of being jealous, of never being able to let her shine. Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush. I stood still, letting her fury burn itself out, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. It was my grandmother who broke the chaos again. She spoke firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough. She told Claire that choices had consequences and that it was time to stop blaming me for her own mistakes. My grandfather stepped up beside her, his presence quiet but unyielding. The silence that followed was unbearable. My father's chest heaved as if he wanted to lash out, but my mother gripped his arm, holding him back. Her eyes never left mine, sharp with both fury and something else I could not quite name, something like fear. I turned toward my grandparents, feeling their steady support behind me, and drew in a deep breath. I told the room that I was not against Claire's happiness, that I wanted nothing more than to see her succeed in her own way. But I would not stand by while my efforts were erased, while my own milestones were turned into props for someone else's spotlight. The words seemed to settle over the room like a heavy cloth. No one moved. Then Andrew's absence pressed itself into the silence, a reminder that the engagement announcement had unraveled in the space of minutes. Claire collapsed into a chair, sobbing loudly, clutching the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. My father snarled that I had destroyed the family. My mother muttered that I would regret this, that I had chosen the wrong moment to rebel. I answered neither of them. For the first time I felt strangely calm, as if speaking the truth had lifted a weight that had been pressing down on me since childhood. Some of the guests began to gather their coats. A neighbor whispered apologies as she slipped past me. The clinking of glassware echoed in the sudden emptiness, a sound that reminded me of a party long over. My grandparents remained seated, their hands entwined, their eyes fixed on me with quiet pride. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the remnants of orchids and golden ribbons, and realized that nothing I could say would change my parents' minds. Their loyalty had always belonged to Claire, no matter the cost. The only difference now was that everyone else had finally seen it too. My mother's voice rose again, shrill with desperation. She said family loyalty meant silence, that airing grievances in public was betrayal. I looked at her, the woman who had raised me with a cold ledger of expectations, and told her that silence was the only betrayal I had ever known. My father stepped forward, his tone dropping to a cold certainty. He said if I left that night, I should not expect to be welcomed back. He warned that there would be no inheritance, no contact, nothing. He said as far as they were concerned, I would no longer exist. The words hit me harder than I expected, though. I had imagined them for years. I felt the sting, but beneath it was a strange clarity. They had already treated me as if I did not exist for most of my life. Tonight only stripped away the pretense. My grandmother rose slowly from her chair, her hand still clutching my grandfather's. She said if my parents truly meant to cut me off, then it was time everyone knew the truth about where their estate was going. Gasps filled the room as her words settled. My mother's head snapped around her lips, parting in disbelief, while my father's fists unclenched, then tightened again. The air was heavy with anticipation, every eye darting between them. My grandmother's gaze did not waver as she prepared to say more. The room that had once been filled with applause and laughter now felt like a courtroom, and I knew we were moments away from the final verdict. My grandmother's words rang through the room with the weight of a gavel. She said that 3 months earlier, she and my grandfather had updated their will, leaving the entire estate to me. A collective gasp swept across the guests, followed by stunned silence. My mother's face drained of color, her lips trembling as if she had been struck. My father turned sharply toward them, his voice rough with disbelief, demanding to know what they meant. My grandfather rose to his feet, his hand resting lightly on my grandmother's shoulder. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, as if to be sure there was no room for doubt. He said they had watched for years, as I carried myself without complaint, even when treated unfairly, and that they could no longer ignore the truth of who had shown strength and integrity. He added that inheritance was not a gift for favoritism, but a responsibility given to someone who had proven they could carry it with dignity. My mother erupted, her voice breaking, as she insisted that Claire was her biological daughter, that she was entitled to everything. She accused them of betrayal, her hands shaking as she pointed toward me. Claire, still sitting with her makeup smeared and her hair undone, cried out that it was unfair, that she had always been the one meant to shine. My grandmother did not flinch. She looked directly at my mother and said that being a parent did not mean choosing one child at the expense of another. She reminded her that she had been given chance after chance to show fairness and love, and each time she had chosen favoritism. That pattern had consequences, and tonight those consequences had finally come due. The room stirred with whispers. Cousins shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. An uncle muttered that he had suspected for years that something was wrong but had never said anything. A neighbor leaned closer to another guest, her voice carrying, as she said it was about time someone stood up to the way things had always been. My father slammed his hand down on the table, the sound sharp as a gunshot. He warned my grandparents that they were making a mistake, that rewarding defiance would only tear the family apart. My grandfather met his glare and told him the family had already been divided by years of favoritism, that tonight was not destruction but truth finally brought into daylight. Claire sobbed harder, her words tumbling out between gasps. She said I had stolen everything from her, that I had waited for the perfect moment to destroy her life. She cried that Andrew had left because of me, that now even her future was slipping away. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt no anger, only exhaustion. I told her quietly that I had never wanted to take anything from her, that all I had ever wanted was to be treated as though I mattered too. My mother lunged forward, her voice rising into a shriek, but my grandmother's sharp tone cut her off. She told her that enough had been said, that there was no use pretending anymore. The truth was out, and the family had seen it for themselves. My grandmother's eyes softened as she turned to me, telling me that I did not need to fight to prove myself anymore. The decision had already been made, and it was final. The guests sat frozen, torn between shock and discomfort. Some avoided my gaze, others nodded slightly, as if silently agreeing with what had been said. One by one, a few began to rise, murmuring polite goodbyes, their footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. The party that had been filled with cheers and music only an hour earlier was unraveling into fragments of quiet departures. My father turned to me one last time, his voice cold as ice. He said if I walked out of the house tonight, I should never expect to walk back in. He told me that as far as he was concerned, I was no longer his daughter. The words should have broken me, but instead, they only confirmed what I had always known. He had let go of me long ago. I picked up my purse from the chair, my hands steady. I looked around the room at the scattered orchids, the half-empty glasses, the golden ribbons drooping in the heat of the chandelier lights. I had once thought this house was where I belonged, but tonight it looked more like a stage where a script had finally unraveled. My grandmother and grandfather stood beside me, their presence firm and reassuring. I felt the weight of their decision not as a burden but as a shield. For the first time, I was not standing alone. Claire collapsed against the table, her sobs turning into bitter mutters accusing me of ruining her life. My mother clung to my father's arm, her face streaked with both rage and humiliation. Neither of them moved to stop me as I walked toward the door. I paused for a moment in the entryway, the cool air from outside brushing against my skin. Behind me, the house that had once been filled with control and silence now stood hollow, stripped of its power over me. Ahead was only the dark winter night and the sound of my grandparents' footsteps as they followed me out. The door closed softly behind us, and with it a chapter of my life finally ended. Snow was falling lightly as we stepped into the driveway, the flakes catching in the glow of the porch light. I breathed in the cold air and felt something lift from my chest, like I had finally set down a weight I had been carrying since childhood. My grandparents walked close on either side of me, and though no words passed between us, their presence wrapped around me with more comfort than I had ever known inside that house. We drove back to their home in silence. The roads were slick, the town quiet, as if even the streets had chosen to rest after all the noise of the night. When we pulled into their driveway, I could see the faint golden glow of their living room through the curtains. It looked warm, safe, real. Inside, Grandma Eleanor placed a hand on my cheek, whispering that I did not need to fight anymore. Grandpa Henry carried my coat to the hook and muttered that family was about more than blood, it was about choice. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but in my heart I knew they were right. The following weeks blurred into winter's steady rhythm. My parents did not call, and I did not expect them to. Claire reached out once, a short message, asking if I was happy now that I had destroyed her life. I stared at the words on the screen, then closed the message without replying. There was nothing left to say. I poured myself back into work, the only place where I had always found solid ground. At the firm, my team leaned on me more than ever. The Prism model was being refined for international markets, and the long hours at the office gave me purpose and peace. Spring came, and with it, new opportunities. My CEO called me into his office and told me he planned to retire within the year. He wanted me to step into his shoes to lead the company into the next chapter. I was stunned, not because I felt unworthy, but because the girl who once sat alone in her tiny bedroom in Salem, overshadowed and silenced, could never have imagined such a future. I accepted, knowing that it was not just a title but proof of every step I had taken on my own. When the official announcement was made, I stood in front of the firm's shareholders' cameras, flashing, voices buzzing. I wore a simple navy suit and steadied my hands on the podium. I spoke about resilience, about finding value not in the approval of others, but in the belief you build within yourself. The applause that followed was thunderous, but all I could think about was calling my grandparents. Later that night, I sat in my office, phone pressed to my ear, as Grandma Eleanor told me she always knew I had it in me. Her words wrapped around me tighter than any accolade ever could. Life settled into a rhythm that finally felt like mine. Every Sunday, I drove to their home for dinner. We sat at the same oak table, passing bowls of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, laughing over old stories. Sometimes they teased me, pretending to forget moments from my childhood, so I would tell them again, their eyes shining as they listened. Those nights reminded me that home was not about walls or inheritance. It was about being seen, about being loved without conditions. As for my parents, they kept their distance. Word drifted through distant relatives that Claire was back living with them, drifting between short-lived jobs and half-hearted ventures. I did not hate her for it, though I felt no urge to bridge the distance. Some relationships are not meant to be mended. Letting go was not bitterness, it was freedom. One afternoon months later, I walked through the firm's lobby after a strategy meeting and saw Claire waiting. She stood in a polished coat, her hair done, but her eyes carried a weariness that even makeup could not mask. She told me quickly that she was not there to apologize. She only wanted to understand how I had managed to build a life without anyone lifting me up. I looked at her not with anger or pity, but with honesty. I told her that I had learned to stand when no one else would hold me, that strength is born when you have no other choice. She stared at me, silent, then turned and walked away. I watched her go, uncertain if she would ever change, but certain that I no longer needed her approval. I returned to my office, my team gathered and ready to build something new. I looked out at the Seattle skyline, the evening light reflecting off the glass towers, and felt a calm certainty wash over me. My journey had not been about revenge alone. It had been about reclaiming myself from the shadows of favoritism and silence. I no longer needed the acknowledgement of those who once overlooked me. I had found my place among those who believed in me, and most importantly, I had learned to believe in myself. That was the truest victory. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of moments when you had to find your own voice against silence, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments. Let me know if you would have done the same in my place. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe so you will never miss the next one.